If I haven't met you, my name's Blake, and I'm one of the owners of the Bee Supply, and I do a lot of beekeeping work. I'm a commercial beekeeper. I was a hobby and sideline beekeeper for many, many years. And then I transitioned to a commercial beekeeper. And now we raise and sell bees. We run the Bee Supply. We have a packing company where we package and sell honey. And then we also still have our commercial migratory beekeeping operation. So a little bit of everything, but I remember really well what it was like to have one beehive in my backyard, all the way to 20,000 hives. So I really try in these webinars to do my best to share with you information that's relevant to your scale as a beekeeper, as probably a small scale, possibly a sideline beekeeper, but pull from the experience out running thousands of hives and apply that to a smaller scale. So that's what the webinar is all about. We try to keep it super practical if you're just joining us. A couple things before we dive into the practical nitty-gritty is if you need bees, we still have bees for sale. So we work really hard not to sell out. Eventually we do sell out, but we always raise extra. And we're kind of coming sort of towards the end. I mean, we're selling nooks and singles through the month of May. But most of the demand is in April. So if you want to order bees and pick them up next week, you can get them in that short of a turnaround. So we do still have bees available. And then over the summer, we sell complete hives as well. And this is super exciting. So this is new. We just got this press release a couple of days ago. It's making the rounds. But we are a dealer for Apivar. So it's the strip that you put in the hive to kill Varroa mites. One of the biggest problems with the Apivar strip is it's very effective, but one of the problems is you have to leave it in for like 42 days. And it's a very, very slow, long kill. It takes a long time to kill all the Varroa mites. And I don't like that. I mean, it's better than most other products on the market, but the problem is when it's in the hive that long, if you have really high Varroa mite counts, it tends to not kill all the Varroa mites. It doesn't do a great job. If you've got 10 mites per 100 bees, the Apivar strips might take it down to 4 or 5 mites per 100 bees, but it doesn't do a great job of knocking them all out. It's not powerful enough. And then the other problem is if you leave it in too long, then you have a sublethal effect on the Varroa mites. So there's not enough chemical left on the strips to kill the Varroa mites, and some of them survive, which means you run the risk of helping those Varroa mites build a resistance to the active ingredient, amitraz. A little hard to do with amitraz because it has a short half-life. It breaks down quickly, but it's possible. So we've been talking to the Apivar folks for a number of years, as have other people, saying, look, we really need a treatment that works really fast for high Varroa mite levels. And so they've just announced that they are coming out with a flash treatment. So it's a paste. It's kind of a gel paste that you have a little caulk gun and put it in the hive. And you can put it in there multiple times a year, and it breaks down super quickly. And you can put it in the hive right before a honey flow, right after a honey flow. You don't have to have it out of the hive for weeks. And then you can use it no matter what the temperature is. So there's no temperature constraints. So we're doing tests with them, and I'll let you know how those tests go to see how effective it is. But starting this summer, you should be able to get this from the Bee Supply or our sister company, the Commercial Bee Supply. So we'll be a dealer for this. And I'll let you know how those tests that we're running go. I'm optimistic though. I think this will be a wonderful new tool in our toolkit for dealing with Varroa mites. So much more on that to come. I'll share our test results, how we used it, how to apply it, etc., at a later date. Monthly magazine, we've got some great stuff in here this month. Sherry, do you want to jump in and tell us a little bit?
Sure, I do. This is the month we've all been waiting for, right? It's honey production. You're either almost there, or you're kind of starting, or you are there. And this is the magazine that we absolutely have been waiting for. I know I have, because it's got all of that rolled into one. So let me look at my notes here. So we're in production mode, and we've got tips for drawing comb. That's a good one. Blake wrote that. Managing supers. Truly, you've got to get into your mindset of how I've got to manage those. It's not just a matter of throwing them on. We got to Got a few things we've got to do in between. Checkerboarding, kind of one of those tricks that James and I like to do. Also using package bees to build your bee yard. That's just a few of the, I'll call them bait articles I'm going to throw at you. All right, so my article spotlight. You want to flip that one for me, Blake?
There you go.
Thanks. So I wrote this because I felt like that, and not to throw my article out there, but the resource colonies have saved us a time or two. If you've ever needed to have backup bees, having resource colonies is the way to do it. So there's an article in this issue on page 10, and that's the title, you see it there. And basically a resource colony is that nuke you see sitting in that picture. This was one of our bee yards years ago. And that was our backup bees. So if you've ever run into a colony that has died, and I don't know why, you've got a backup colony to replace it. If you've ever run into a queenless situation, no, I'm sure we're the only ones, right? And it's Saturday late afternoon, and you can't make it to the bee supply store until probably Tuesday. All of a sudden you're desperate for a queen and all of these things are running through your head. You've got one right there and the resources to go with her. High mite load, your population was low for a while, but you got that in check, but your population's still not great. Just rob a frame or two out of that. They truly do work, and you can make them forever nukes. It takes practice and it takes some knowledge, but believe me, James and I've done it for years and it truly does work. So check this article out, page 10, resource colonies, how to always have backup bees, or forever nukes as we called them. So I hope you look at it. All right, I'm good. That's yours, Blake.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. I love that article. I love having a resource nook at all times. I mean, that's so helpful. Another thing I like to do, and I think you mentioned this, Sherry, was if I have a 5-frame nuke that I'm using kind of as a queen bank, I always have a backup queen that way. And then, yeah, I love to pull brood out of that throughout the year to boost up weaker hives. I'm always pulling, frame a brood out every week and boosting up the hive. So I love the idea. Super, super helpful. Hey, real quick, before we jump in again, our Round Rock store is open. It opened almost a month ago now, and it's done so well. The biggest challenge has been keeping it stocked. So if you've been to the store, thank you for your patience. Your support and your shopping has been overwhelming. And we have really been scrambling to keep the store stocked. So we have a truckload of stuff going there tonight. We're working on getting new shipments in every week to fill up the store and keep it stocked. But it's been an adventure keeping it stocked. So thank you. It's a great problem. If you need something, you might just want to call ahead to make sure it's there before you show up. But we're quickly getting ahead of those issues. But it's been a good problem. So thank you for that. Okay, so hey, before we jump out to the bee yard and really go through hives like we usually do, I wanted to give you guys a quick update. Just, you may not find this interesting, but I did. I'm a board member on the National Honey Board. The National Honey Board gets 2 cents out of every pound of honey sold in the United States. Through if you import honey or package and sell over 250,000 pounds of honey a year, you have to contribute 2 cents out of every pound to the National Honey Board. And the National Honey Board takes that money and uses it to promote honey in the United States. So it's a really cool company. They've got, or not a company, but a board. We've got about a $10 million budget, and all of that goes to promoting honey in a wide variety of ways. The National Honey Board also monitors threats to the honey industry and finds ways to combat those threats through marketing and promotion. And one of the big, we had we have a meeting every twice a year. So we have a fall meeting and a spring meeting. We just had our spring meeting a few weeks ago in Austin, actually. And that picture of me in our Austin store with the bear, who was actually the store manager, Becky, who has done an amazing job. I was on my way to the National Honey Board when I stopped by and we took that picture. But one of the biggest threats that they're monitoring right now that we're trying to work on is synthetic honey. And there's two different companies that are really starting to push this. One is BIO and other is MellyBio. And you can see the stat sheets that they've created at the bottom of this slide, the benefits of their synthetic honey versus real honey. I'm a little encouraged because if you notice, they don't know how to spell pesticides there on that second line. So hopefully that's a good sign for us in the beekeeping industry. But these companies are doing something pretty innovative. The BIO company is actually taking a cell from a honeybee stomach and a cell from nectar from a certain flower, and they're growing that in a lab to create honey. And so it's kind of like, cell-based meat, where they're taking a cell of the cow and growing it. They're doing that using a honeybee gut cell from their honey stomach, and they're doing it from a certain type of flower. And they can take a cell from any flower to kind of create varietals. So, and then MellyBio is basically they're replicating a bee's stomach in a vat, and they're fermenting nectar from flowers and kind of replicating the honey process. And these are a pretty big threat to the honey industry because while they're very expensive at the moment, it tastes, looks, and smells, granulates exactly like real honey. And at the moment, on ingredient labels, they can call it honey. So you can have, Honey Nut Cheerios, and on the ingredients, it can say honey, and it's actually this synthetic honey. As long as the price point stays high, it's not a huge threat, but they're working really hard to sell this cheaper than honey. So at whatever point this is sold cheaper than honeybee honey, it'll become a major threat to the beekeeping industry and the honey industry. So a big problem for our industry is certainly something that we're all working on. We're obviously working on making it illegal to call it honey. That's obviously the first step, but it's a real threat, something that everyone should be aware of. It's not big on the market yet. It's starting to get there, but we think they're a year or two away from getting the price point down. So you're probably not going to see this on the grocery store shelf soon, but they're working hard on it. Speaking of the National Honey Board, one little kind of industry insider tip for you guys you're probably not aware of. If you go to the National Honey Board's website, which is honey.com, and you go to honey.com/shop, if you are a beekeeper, they have about 20 different products that you can order for free. They'll send them, you can make one order per year, but part of that money goes to educating the industry. And so this is a screenshot. So they have like these cool honeybee stickers, and you can order 500 a year. They have all these recipe booklets, all these pamphlets about bees and beekeeping, pamphlets for kids. So they've got, we've got 15, 20 different pamphlets, booklets, recipe booklets, and you can order, anywhere from 50 to 500 of each of these per year and give them away at farmers markets, give them away to your honey customers. There are these really cool giveaway items that are free. So honey.com/shop. Okay, so hey, let's jump out to the bee yard. Let's see what the bees are doing this month. And then we're going to come back in to the PowerPoint and review a few more topics. But let's jump out to the bee yard. Here we go.
So when is it time to add your first brood box? So this hive obviously is just a single story hive that we split about a month ago. So let's see if it's ready to add a honey super or not. Now, look fast. The best time to gauge bee population is right when you open the lid. So this hive, they've got 8 frames and a feeder. And looking down between these frames, you can see that all between the frames are pretty full of bees. Now I've got some bees hanging out over here on the side, but I can see daylight, between frames here. So it's not completely packed full of bees, but of the of the 8 frames, about 7 of them are covered in bees. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and add a brood box to this hive. They've got brood, they've got a lot of bees, They've got eggs and larvae. They're growing, they're storing honey. And so, you know, it's time to go ahead and add that box. I tend to err on the side of adding my second brood box or even my honey supers a little too soon rather than too late. So even if I'm like, is it 70 or 80% full? I usually go ahead and add a box. As long as they've got a healthy queen, they're laying, it's 70 to 80% full of bees, whether it's a brood box or a honey super, I'm going to go ahead and add that box. Something that's just really fun. Check that out. So this was a hive that went queenless, and look at all of those hatched out queen cells. So they went queenless, they raised their own queen, and just, you know, those are all hatched out queen cells from when the bees raised their own queen. Pretty cool. That's just a ton of them. And bees often do that. They'll raise an excess of queen cells in the hive if they lose their queen. So this hive, it might be a slightly premature. I would say they're closer to 70% full of bees, but I'm out here in the bee yard, so I'm gonna go ahead and add our second brood box. It's not gonna hurt them. And I'm gonna give them a little more feed just so they can really have some extra food to store up into the second brood box. And then hopefully in about 3 weeks or so, maybe a month, we'll be able to add a honey super and start making honey. A really common question is, you know, when should I add my first honey super? And there's all different ways you can decide when to do that. Time of year, is the major honey flow starting? But the way I find most effective is, what do your bees look like? Now, I'm not talking about, you know, when does the honey flow start, but if it's spring, you've already done your splits and you're just waiting for the honey flow, I always add my first honey super when my top box is 80% full of bees. So this hive, we've already added their second brood box and they've already been working on filling it up. So I'm just checking now to see, okay, is it time to add my first honey super, or do they still have more work to do up in this second box? So I'm gonna take a quick look, and I left my smoker over there, but these bees are pretty gentle today because they're busy. So I should have added a honey super to this one sooner. You can see, if you look at the top, there are bees filling the edges all throughout this box. You know, it's more than 80% full of bees. So I should have added a honey super sooner, but this hive needs a super right away. So when you open that lid and you're looking down between those frames, if there are bees covering more than 80% of those frames and you're not seeing any daylight down between those frames because it's so full of bees, it's absolutely time to add a box. Another great indicator of a strong hive is burr comb. So if this hive doesn't have a lot on it, but if they've got a bunch of excess comb on top of the frames, I love to see that. It's a great sign. So on this outside frame, you can see these bees are drawing out a bunch of white beeswax up here at the top of the frame. That's another great sign. It's a strong hive. They're drawing excess comb. I really love to see the bees drawing out excess comb all over the place. It's annoying when they do that, but it's a sign of a really good, strong, healthy hive. So this is our top brood box, so I'm absolutely going to add another box on top, and that's going to be our honey super. They're very much ready for that honey super. Okay, let's do a quick check on this hive. So this hive has 2 brood boxes. You can't see it in the video, but there's 2 deep brood boxes. And about 10 days ago or so, we added a honey super. And so we're gonna look at this honey super and see if they put any honey in it. One thing you may notice is this honey super has 9 frames in it. So I'm a big fan of putting 8 or 9 frames in my honey super, and you want those frames evenly spaced out. You don't want them shoved tightly together. Now that's in contradiction to a brood box. So your brood box should have all the frames pushed tightly together so they don't keep widening those frames, making them hard to pull out. But in your honey super, you want all of these frames spaced out, and that makes the bees draw out those frames a little bit wider, and it's easier to slice that wax capping off when you're harvesting honey. Sometimes commercially, I mean, we run often 8 frames in a medium super. So if we have a medium honey super, or 6 5/8, we'll often run 8 frames, so they get really thick and wide. And they're smaller frames, they can handle the weight a little bit better. Deep boxes, we typically do 9 frames, even commercially, and space them out. And that's really the key, is to space them out evenly. If you leave a big gap, they're just going to draw burrcomb all over the place and make a mess. If you push them all tightly together, you defeat the purpose, and they can't widen that comb out enough, and it's going to be hard to slice off those wax cappings when it comes time to harvest. So running 9 frames in your honey supers is ideal, and it really just helps them widen those frames out a little bit. So we had some foundation up here. You can see they're just starting to draw out this foundation. This box was a mix of foundation and comb, already drawn comb. I really don't like, unless you're a brand new beekeeper and all you have is foundation, I don't really like putting a whole entire box of foundation on my hive. I like to introduce a little bit of foundation every year, and that way my bees don't have to draw out an entire box of foundation. So what I would do is I would put every other frame foundation and every other frame drawn comb, and then my bees don't have to do quite as much work, and they're much faster drawing out that comb if there's, or drawing out that foundation if there's already some comb up there. So you can see, like, this was a previously drawn frame from last year, and this was a frame of foundation. So we've kind of spaced it every other, and you can see on the side facing away from the comb, they haven't really started drawing it yet, but on the side facing this old frame, they've already drawn it out. So it encourages them to move up into the super a little faster if every other frame is comb versus foundation. Now, if you're a brand new beekeeper and all you have is foundation, that's fine. You can put the whole box of foundation on and they'll draw it out. But for year 2, I really recommend doing every other. So this is one of those old frames, and this is really the advantage of doing those 9 frames. If you look from the side, you can kind of see how wide they've drawn out this honeycomb. And that really just makes it easier to uncap when it comes time to harvest. But they've got a lot of nectar in here. I mean, they've done a great job. You can see it's just totally full of nectar. I mean, this hive has probably brought in, 20, 30 pounds of honey already. And I can't help myself. You never get honey better than fresh out of the honeycomb. It's just so hard not to taste it. You can see it's a super light honey, and I just have to taste it and see what it tastes like. I'm super curious what kind of honey it is, what kind they're bringing in. Now I'm all sticky. It was worth it though. Oh, that's so good. So it's primarily pincushion honey, or scabiosa. There's a bunch of different names for it, but scabiosa or pincushion. It's a tall purple flower that's really common in Texas, and delicious honey, kind of a fruity taste to it. So this hive is doing great. I mean, we've spaced out these frames of foundation. They're drawing out the foundation. They are drawing out filling up the comb with nectar, just like we had hoped. And so I'm going to space these carefully apart, and this hive will hopefully fill up this box of honey in the next week or 2. Hey friends, so I want to make a quick video showing you a hive that has a lot of bee activity on the front of it, almost bearding, but not quite. So you can see these 2 hives here. This one over here is normal bee activity. There's lots of bees going in and out, but there's not a beard of bees or an excessive amount of bees at the entrance. This one, however, has almost a beard of bees, not quite, but when I see a hive with a lot of bees on the front of it, whether it's a beard or just a lot of activity like this one has, first of all, I'm not usually concerned. Even if there's a beard of bees kind of hanging down a little bit, that's really common to see in the evenings as all the foragers return, and they don't want to crowd the hive and overheat the hive, so all the foragers can kind of hang out on the front of the hive in the evenings. That's really common to see. But when I do see a hive with this much bee activity on the front and excess bees, or if I see a beard, the one thing I do is a quick check and make sure I have enough space in my boxes. If all of these boxes are full of bees, I'm absolutely going to add another box to this hive to make sure it's not getting ready to swarm. So it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but when I see this much activity, I just do a really quick check, often of the top box, to see, hey, is that top box full? And sure enough, this top box I see bees between every single frame. It's almost completely full of bees. Sometimes a lot of excess bees in the front is an indicator that it's time to add another box. Not always, don't rely on that exclusively, but it's an indicator. So I'm looking at this box, and this top box, it's hard to see because some of the bees have run down, but it's pretty much completely full of bees, and the box underneath it is completely full of bees. So in this situation, I'm going to add a fourth box so that they don't think about swarming. So this is a hive that's obviously very strong. Their two brood boxes are full of bees. Their third honey super up on top is full of bees. They need another box. And so we're going to add another box. And I do this in the springtime. You know, if this was all full in the summer or the fall, I wouldn't bother adding another box. You know, 3 boxes is plenty. But going into a honey flow in the springtime when swarming is still a risk and they're getting ready to bring in a ton of honey and store it in the supers, I'm going to go ahead and add a 4th box so they don't get any ideas about swarming and they've got plenty of room for those bees. I wouldn't really add a 5th box until until this 3rd and 4th box are pretty full of honey. But once this box and the next box I'm going to add are about 80% full of honey, I'm going to go ahead and add a 5th box. So stay ahead of your bees, especially this time of year, to keep them from swarming. And you don't want them to fill up all their space in your honey supers and start storing all that honey down in the brood box, because that's when you can run into issues with them overcrowding the brood nest with nectar and forcing the queen to making it so the queen has nowhere to lay. Honey bound. I blanked on the word. Honey bound is the word I'm looking for. So when they fill up the brood nest with nectar instead of brood, we call that being honey bound. So we don't want that to happen.
Okay, guys, so there is our bee yard segment. It was a beautiful day out there. I mean, it's fun. Well, it's usually fun being in the bee yard, but especially when it's just beautiful weather like that, it's so much fun. Looking at that hive, fortunately it wasn't about the swarm. As the honey flow really progresses, bees get less and less likely to swarm because they really want to stave their population to bring in more honey. And so once the major honey flow starts, the swarms really decrease. You see more swarms kind of leading up to the major honey flow. That's when I'm most concerned about swarms. I think it was last year. I'll tell you a quick swarm story, and then we'll move on. I think it was last year. I was in a bee yard and I was by myself, and I'm really terrible at I can't let a swarm go. Like if I see a swarm in one of our bee yards, I've got to catch it. It's like it's like $100 bill, sitting up there in that tree. And even if they're like way up in a tree, too high, I should just let them go. I just can't. It just drives me crazy. And a lot of our commercial bee yards, we may have hundreds of beehives in a commercial yard. And so it's, every time you go into the yard, there's a swarm or two. And so we always catch them if they're accessible. But I always tell our crews, like, hey, look, don't kill yourself over it. I mean, if they're way up in a tree, just let them go. That doesn't apply to me apparently. And so there was a swarm, and it was about 15 feet up in a tree, in a cedar tree. And I had a forklift with me. I had one of our bee forklifts with me, and it was way up there. And I was like, if I lift a pallet up to 10 feet with this forklift, and bring a bucket up there with me, and then climb up the mast of the forklift, and then I could get this swarm. It's like, okay, piece of cake. And so I get this bucket and I climb up the mast of the forklift, stand on the pallet that's 10 feet up. And so I'm getting this swarm, and this swarm was massive. I mean, it was like 3 basketballs. I mean, I think it was multiple swarms that had joined together. And so I'm shaking it off, and that they've been there a while. So they were really mean. I mean, they were like all over me. And so I've got them all in this bucket, and I'm holding this bucket, and I'm about to start trying to climb down the mast, and the slat that I'm standing on breaks on the pallet. And so I start falling, and my bee suit, the leg of my bee suit catches on some nails on the pallet. And so I'm hanging upside down off of this pallet, And of course, the bucket of bees I'm holding dumps over my entire body. And, of course, my bee suit kind of pulls up at the ankles, and I've got, getting hundreds of stings, and I'm just stuck hanging upside down. No one's in this bee yard, hanging by my ankles. And, and so I had to, like, you know, the good thing, I guess I should probably put this in our advertising, but I was wearing one of our super suits and I couldn't get the material to break. I kept, trying to bounce. So I was hoping I would tear the material so that I would fall, and I couldn't get the material to tear. And so I finally had to just keep bouncing until the pallet finished breaking, and then I could fall, and then, I was fine other than a bunch of stings. And then I, caught what it was left of the swarm and put them in a hive. So anyway, that's my swarm story for the night. But it was an adventure. It was a lot of fun. I wish somebody had been there filming it and we could have been YouTube famous, but maybe next time. Okay, so let's get into some monthly tips. So May tips, I cannot believe that it's May already. Somehow it's already May, but here we are. There's a lot blooming. I mean, if you're anywhere in the South, there's a lot of high nectar blooms blooming. This is just a cross section of some high nectar blooms across the South. But in anywhere within 500 miles of the Gulf in general is starting our major nectar flow. I love these maps. You guys know I talk about these all the time. You're probably sick of them, but this is the progression of the leaf index. So this is showing plants leafing out. And let me see if I can pause it. Let's see. Oops, no, I think I just, so the red is above average, above normal, so it's early, and then the blue is late. So this is the plants that are leafing out. So you can kind of see the entire south and southeast is really early. Again, red indicates plants are leafing out early, and then blue is plants are leafing out late. So west, and the southwest and the Pacific Northwest and then the central Midwest is very late, whereas all this red is early when it comes to leafing out. So that's super interesting. And then more relevant to us as beekeepers is this is the bloom index. So this is when plants start to bloom. Now this is not major nectar flows. This is just when are the first plants starting to bloom. So this is more of an indication of when your pollen flow begins. And then your major nectar flow is going to follow this by a couple of months at least. So this is just showing, hey, this is when you should start seeing pollen in your hives, and if it's late or early. So again, you're pretty early in the south and the southeast. And then again, you're kind of late in the west, southwest, and then central is running a little bit late. So, yeah, I'll let you see that one more time. But again, this is just for pollen flow, not major nectar flow. But the major nectar flow is probably going to roughly be early or late according to this map. So if you're in the red, your nectar flow is early. If you're in the blue, your major nectar flow is going to be a little bit on the late side. So as far as major honey flow, so those major nectar producing plants, again, this is kind of what I'm seeing. That bloom map tends to indicate the start of the pollen flow, not the honey flow. In most cases, I find that the major honey flow follows that bloom map by 2 to 3 months. So if you go back and rewatch this recording, you can kind of see where you are as that map progresses, and you can kind of watch the date at the bottom. And your major honey flow is probably going to start a couple months after that pollen flow hits. So hopefully that makes sense. It's in our magazine too. So check it out in our magazine. We've got those maps in there too. One more map, and then I'll get off my map soapbox. But this is the drought map for the US as of May 4th. And this is also an indicator of what kind of honey crop you're going to have. So obviously white means there is no drought. Yellow, brown, minor drought. The darker red, the worst drought. So I mean, you poor folks in Nebraska and Kansas. I mean, my goodness, it's getting rough. Parts of Oklahoma, and then I mean, half of the state of Texas is pretty rough. So I've certainly seen it worse. but for parts of the central US, it's pretty bad as far as drought. But most of the country is looking okay at the moment. I want to jump to Lauren Ward real quick. She has a few great suggestions on how to tell when your major honey flow begins. It's a big question a lot of people have, is how do I tell when I should start adding supers and when my major honey flow begins? And Lauren has some really good suggestions on how to tell for your local area that your major honey flow is beginning.
How you tell the honey flow has begun. In the spring, it's usually pretty dramatic. But for me, part of beekeeping is learning everything bee adjacent. And so if you're in Texas, you may know one of the first major flows is Yaupon. So if you're Central or East Texas, Yaupon holly is going to be one of your first major flows. And so I find myself learning more and more plants, keeping an eye on things. And so usually I know when something is close to blooming. Like this year, I was watching the elm trees, as I do most years, and they bloom about the third week of January here. But if looking in your hives and outside your hives, even the way to know you're on a honey flow, you're going to have a whole lot of activity. It's going to sound like an airport because they're coming in loaded with nectar. So they're heavy bees coming into land. They may have some congestion at the entrance because there's so many foragers going out if you've got a real populous hive. When you look in that hive, you're going to probably have they're going to be doing what's called whitening comb. And what that is they're making wax. They're kind of stimulated to make wax. And so around the edges of things, there's going to be bright white new wax. That's a really good sign. And then honestly, as you're lifting through it, if they've been putting it up a little while, you'll know it's heavy. But right at the first, you may just have a whole lot of frames that have that, shine of nectar in the cells. As a flow goes on, so like a really heavy, like a tallow flow, they may even start cramming that nectar into cells you don't want them to, kind of in the brood nest. So that's another sign. So yeah, spring usually comes on, hard, heavy. And then that kind of slows down. So we've got several plants that are really heavy producers, and then little plants in the middle that are decent producers. And then summer kind of dries off, and then we get to fall, and most of the time we get decent honey in the fall. It depends. Depends on where you are. If you're in a good goldenrod area, that's great. Actually, the hill country does fairly well in the fall, to me, surprisingly well. In the fall, they may not be stimulated quite to that same extent as they are in the spring. So you might not see them whitening a lot of comb. You might not see that, but you are probably going to notice just weight-wise. So the fall is when I'm going, especially later in the fall, to go check weight. And by weight, I mean honey and nectar, because that's the heavy stuff. And so, you take that super off, and all of a sudden it weighs 20 pounds. And that's the fall flow. And it'll creep up on you. They can sometimes put up quite a bit of honey, and if not, you're feeding. So that's when I'm noticing, is when I'm checking for weight anyway, and I'm saying either the plants will do it or I will do it in the fall, but it's a little more gradual than the spring.
Super helpful. I love those points. That's really helpful to know when your honey flow begins. I do want to take a quick poll because I'm really curious what you guys are seeing as far as your nectar flow. I'm curious what you do to tell, what signs do you primarily rely on to tell the major nectar flow has begun? Do you watch for specific flowers? Do you think your nectar flow has begun when your bees are whitening combs? When you see excess nectar in your combs? When your bees are drawing out comb, a specific date tells you. So when you're trying to decide if your major nectar flow begins, what factors are you looking at to make that determination? So experienced beekeepers, I think, are going to right away have an answer, but this will be helpful for the new beekeepers to see what most people use to rely on telling if the major nectar flow begins. I was going to put all of the above, but then I figured, hey, everyone's going to select all of the above, because really, as a beekeeper, we're kind of looking at all those factors in the poll to tell if our major nectar flow has begun or not. So we're kind of, you should be looking at all of them, but what's your primary one? So what's the one thing like, oh, if I see this happening, our major nectar flow has begun. So, okay, so I'm going to end it. Most of you, a few of you responded, and it looks like 33% said when a specific flower begins to bloom. And then second was 30% said when I see excess nectar in my combs. I totally agree. I mean, I'm looking for those specific flowers. When I see certain flowers blooming in my area that I know are high nectar yielding flowers, that's when I know the flow's on. But then of course, the best way to, or not the best way, but a really good way is look at your bees. You know, are you seeing them storing lots of fresh nectar in your super? If you are, of course, the flow's on. So yeah, looking at flowers and then looking at what's going on in your beehive are great ways to tell. Lauren mentioned a few times in that survey that I polled it too, whitening the combs. What does whitening the combs look like? This picture shows you. It's really just when you see that fresh white comb kind of being added to the top bars, to the underside of your lid. This was a hive, one of our hives day before yesterday, you know, and they're adding this white comb to the lid and to the top bars. That's a great sign. It means they're bringing in fresh nectar enough to draw out excess comb. The tricky thing about this one is it could also mean you're feeding them. So if you're feeding them a lot of syrup, then they're going to do the same thing. But if you're not feeding them and you're seeing this white comb, it's a great sign that there's a strong nectar flow on. What other things should you be seeing as you look at your hives this time of year? You know, I mean, lots of brood. I mean, every hive should have quite a bit of brood. If you're more in the northern United States, you're not going to see as much brood. But even so, now that the days are longer, all beehives should have some brood. If you're in the south, you're going to have like a bazillion frames of brood. If you're more in the north, you may only have a couple, but you should be seeing brood of all stages in all hives. I want to touch on this really briefly before we move on to a few other topics. Spotting eggs and larvae. This comes up every year, especially if you're a newer beekeeper. There's the thought that, oh man, I should either be able to find my queen every time I look at a hive, or I should be able to see eggs to verify if my queen is in the hive. Eggs are really, really hard to see. I mean, we get at the Bee Supply, we get hundreds of calls a week. People that think their hive is queenless because they can't see eggs. Totally fair concern, you know, but eggs, most people can't see eggs. And this picture, they're really obvious. You've got black foundation, brand new white comb, and this was taken with a smartphone. And then I zoomed way up with the smartphone to try to spot eggs. And now you can see them. So you can try that if you're having a hard time finding eggs. You know, hold your frame so that the sunlight is beaming right down into those cells. Take a bunch of pictures with your smartphone, and then go in where it's dark and zoom in and see if you can see some eggs. So this same picture zoomed back out, this picture on the right and the bottom, you can't even see those eggs. So that's about how far you'd normally be holding it from your face, not zoomed up, and they're really hard to see. And again, this is perfect situation, black foundation, white comb. This is how most frames look. You know, this is a very normal color frame. This is a very, and this frame actually has some nectar on the edges, but this whole center area is full of eggs. It's almost impossible to see them. So what I encourage beekeepers to really do is find larvae, find cat brood. Don't worry so much about finding eggs because it's just going to be really, really tough to find them. So caring for hives this time of year, a couple things to focus on is feeding. So in most areas, your brand new hive, if you're new to beekeeping and you're new to have a brand new hive, they have a lot of foundation to draw out, and feeding is going to be helpful. The idea is to feed them enough so that they have all the resources they need to draw out honeycomb, but not overfeed so that they're filling up the whole brood nest with nectar. I tend to find that most hives that are at least a half a box or more full of bees, you know, a gallon a week or so is a great target, and they tend to do well at that. You don't need to feed pollen substitute this time of year. And then, like the video said, add your second brood box when your first one is 80% full. If you have a hive that's less than a deep box full of bees, or I'm sorry, less than half of a deep box full of bees, you can put the insurance reducer on. Just leave it on the biggest opening. So again, I hate to be repetitive, but this is important. When your second box, whether it's time to add another box when your top box is 80% full. And that's true whether it's a brood box or a honey super. So when your honey super gets 80% full of honey and bees, add another box. When that box gets 80% full, add another box. When should you stop adding supers? That depends on your area, and that's where talking to local beekeepers can be really helpful. Usually I'm adding my last honey supers about 10 days before my major nectar flow ends. So when the flowers start wilting a little bit and start dying, that's when I'm kind of cutting back on adding supers. I want my bees to really fill up the final that top super before the honey flow ends. So I'm kind of, it's a bit of a balancing act, but when those flowers are starting to die, I might check my hive a couple times a week. And if they're not really packing out that top super, I probably won't add another one. If they've really packed it out and there's still some flowers blooming, I would go ahead and add another one and then watch and see how quickly they fill it. You can add 2 supers at once. So if you've got a really strong hive, I do this all the time. I mean, if I've got a really strong hive and I don't want to revisit my bee yard in a week, I'll absolutely put 2 supers on at once. So it's fine to add. I wouldn't do more than 2, but if you've got a really strong hive and you're at the very beginning of the honey flow, it's fine to add a couple of supers at a time. And then the last point on supering is what's bottom supering and should you do it? So bottom supering, and we have a couple videos on our YouTube channel. So if you just go to our YouTube channel and search supers, you'll see it. But bottom supering is when it's time to add your second super. Instead of just putting it on top, you would actually lift up your full super and put your empty super underneath it. So you bottom super. And that speeds the bees up a little bit. They fill it with nectar a little bit faster. If it's foundation, they will draw it out faster if it's bottom supered. If you've got all drawn out honeycomb, I just top super, I just keep stacking them up. It's way simpler, way faster. But if I even commercially, if I have foundation, undrawn honeycomb, I do prefer to bottom super because they will draw it out much faster if it's bottom super. Checkerboarding frames. So this comes up every single year. Every single year I see people do it. Checkerboarding is when we put one frame of comb, a frame of foundation, a frame of comb, frame of foundation. I did it to the honey super in our bee yard video. I checkerboarded. It's perfectly fine to do it, and I recommend doing it in honey supers. I never recommend doing it in your brood boxes. So you should never put frame of brood, frame of foundation, frame of brood, frame of foundation. You should never checkerboard in your honey supers. The brood should always stay together with your empty frames on the outside. That's so the bees can take care of that brood, keep it warm, etc. So don't ever checkerboard in your brood boxes, only checkerboard in your honey supers. Some really common things, we've got just a couple minutes till we get to our Q&A. Some really common things that you tend to see in late spring. I hear these all the time. My hive suddenly went queenless. Maybe they swarmed and didn't raise a new queen. Maybe you accidentally killed her. Could be your queen just wore out. So a queenless hive this time of year, fortunately, is really, really fixable. There's lots of queens available. The quickest, easiest thing to do is just buy a queen and put her in. If I see hatched queen cells, so if I'm going through a hive and I see a bunch of hatched queen cells like we saw, but I'm not seeing brood yet, I'm not going to put a $40 queen in a hive that has hatched queen cells because there's a good chance I've got a virgin queen running around. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a frame of eggs and larvae from one of my other hives, and I'm going to put it in that queenless hive. And then I'm going to come back and check it 2 or 3 days later. If that hive is truly queenless, they're going to have queen cells all over the place on that frame of brood you just added in. Then I'm going to invest in a $40 queen and put the queen in the hive, because now I know they're queenless. If they don't raise queen cells on that frame of brood, I'm not gonna give them a $40 queen, because that probably means they've got a virgin queen in there that hasn't started laying yet. So that's a pretty, we do that all the time to tell if a hive has a queen or not before we stick a new one in it. Bees aren't drawing out comb in your honey super or your second brood box. Bees aren't drawing comb. Super duper common. A lot of things can cause this. The most common two, one is your bees just aren't strong enough. Bees are going to draw out honeycomb as they need it. We try as beekeepers to push them and get them to do it faster. But the reality is, if they need it, they'll draw it out. So sometimes we can get ahead of our bees. It takes a really full hive of bees to draw out foundation. So usually we just need to be more patient. The second most common issue is that they don't have enough food. So if they're short on food, if they don't have a lot of nectar coming in and you're not feeding them or not feeding them enough, they're not going to draw out honeycomb, because it takes 10, 11 pounds of honey or syrup to make 1 pound of beeswax. That's how they make wax. They gorge themselves on honey and then produce wax. So they've got to have a lot of excess food to draw out wax. So if you've got a super strong hive and they're not drawing out wax, my guess is they need to be fed. If you've just got a mediocre hive, it's not like it's a box packed full of bees and you're feeding them, but they're still not drawing it out, they're probably just not strong enough. The last thing to watch out for is bees won't draw out foundation through a queen excluder. So if you've added a queen excluder and put a box of foundation above that queen excluder, they typically will not travel through that queen excluder to draw out foundation. So take the queen excluder off and they'll often move up faster and draw out that foundation. Last thing is, if the foundation is old, if it got a layer of dust on it, bees don't like to draw it out. So if you've got old dusty foundation, put a fresh coat of beeswax on it. You can melt beeswax, brush it on. We sell beeswax that you can use to do that. Or you can just get a block of beeswax and just scrape it over the surface of that foundation, and that'll give it that fresh, fresh new beeswax smell. Bees will draw it out. The other thing I like to do, it can be a bit of a pain to like melt a block of beeswax and paint it onto a frame. What I like to do is if you're just doing it to a few frames, get that block of wax, scrape it over the top, and then you can just put it in like that. But the other thing you can do is get a hair dryer and turn it on as hot as it'll go, and then just melt that beeswax that you scraped onto the foundation with that hair dryer. Works great. Your bees aren't growing. Again, a lot of times, if they've got a queen, you're seeing brood, you're feeding them, and they're just slow. Bees can just be slow sometimes. We have to be patient. And, you can give them maybe a frame of cat brood from another hive to give them a boost. But, if you're a first year beekeeper, it's just going to take a while. Your bees have growing to do. And then the last thing we hear a lot is, my bees aren't drinking the syrup. I'm giving them syrup and they aren't drinking it. Why? And there's again reasons for that. If there's a strong nectar flow, the bees may not want your syrup. They'd rather have nectar. So that could be a cause. It could be if the hive's really weak, they might not drink it. If your syrup is too thin, the thinnest syrup you should do is 1 part water to 1 part sugar. If it's thinner than that, the bees don't like to drink it. But 9 times out of 10, if they're not drinking the syrup, it's either it's almost always they just don't need it. Is the most typical thing. You can leave it in there and they'll drink it as they need it. So, okay, only a couple more slides left. So if you have questions for me and Jake, go ahead and start putting them in the Q&A box. And that way we'll have some questions once we get started. A couple quick slides. We'll start in about 5 minutes. We'll jump into the Q&A. Couple quick things to bring us home. Varroa mites. So if you're in an area where you have your honey supers on, the window is closed for treatments if you want to harvest honey. If you're in an area where you're still a month away from your major nectar flow starting, go ahead and treat. If your mites are below 3 per 100 and you already have honey supers on, you can wait to treat until after you harvest honey. If you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 mites per 100 bees in your mite test, you might want to think about doing some sort of a organic treatment that you can do while honey supers are on. If I have a hive that's really overrun with mites, I often pull the honey supers off, put them on a different hive, and treat that infected hive for mites if they have really high mite counts. For sake of time, you can go to our YouTube channel. We've got lots of videos on how to test for mites and using sticky boards, using alcohol washers, etc. So if you don't know how to treat for mites, jump over to the YouTube channel. We've got several on there. But just keep in mind, if you have honey supers on, you don't want to use any chemical mite treatment because it'll contaminate your honey. If you have, again, like 4 or 5 mites per 100 bees and you want to try to get those numbers down while you have your honey supers on the hive, you can use some of these more organic, or well, I should say mechanical mite control methods like drone frames, screen bottom boards, powdered sugar. These are temporary solutions. They won't get rid of your mite problem, but they can pull those numbers down to hold you over until you harvest honey. So we don't have time to get into all these methods, but you can look up how to use drone frames for controlling mites. Screen bottom boards are simple, but if the powdered sugar method, every week or so, you can sprinkle about a cup of powdered sugar between the frames and your 2 brood boxes, and that'll dislodge mites and they'll fall through the screen bottom board. Again, it's not going to fully control your Varroa mites, but it'll help reduce the numbers until you can treat after the honey flow. Drone layers, another common thing we see this time of year. You can see this picture on the right. A lot of this brood is super bumpy and kind of in a shotgun pattern. For the sake of time, I'm going to say if you have a drone layer, then what I recommend doing is shaking the bees out of it and storing that comb for next year. Typically, they're just not worth saving. One thing that is important to understand is if your drone laying hive is a queen that has failed or worker bees that are laying. If your queen is just failing, then you're going to see kind of like this frame. This frame has a mix of drone brood and worker bee brood all in the same frame. You'll also just see 1 egg per cell. That's just more of a sign of a failing queen. In that situation, you can just find that queen killer and reintroduce a new queen to the hive, and that fixes drone laying queen. If you see no worker bee brood anywhere in the hive and it's all drone layers and it's all drone brood and there's multiple eggs per cell, that's an indication that you've got laying workers, and that's very hard to correct. I don't, in that situation, I would just shake the bees out, start over. If you want to try to save them, you can go, we've got a couple articles on our blog, on our website on saving drone laying hives. You can check those out. But in general, I just shake them out and move on, because even if you do everything right, it's very, very hard to save a drone laying hive. All right, I think this is the last slide. Small hive beetles and wax moths. This great big grub you see is a wax moth larva, and the really little one is a small hive beetle larva. You might see a couple of these in your hives. The small hive beetles or the black beetles, they're very common to see 3 or 4 or 5 of them in a hive. You might see a larva or 2. It's not normal to see more than like 1 larva in your hive. You shouldn't see more than 1 wax moth or small hive beetle larva in your hive. Your bees should do a really good job of getting rid of those. The times I do see more than 1, it's usually if one, your hive is super weak, then the larva can start taking over, or a common area you see them is if there's somewhere in your hive that they can hide and the bees can't access them to get rid of them. We see this in nooks a lot, because in the nooks, the frames sit solidly on the bottom board instead of hanging above the bottom board like they do in the hive. And so those larvae can get under those frames and hide. So when you pull those frames out, sometimes you'll see a couple larvae on the bottom. The bees pull those out and get rid of them really quickly. But how you control these is just having a strong hive. If you see 1 or 2 in a nook, I wouldn't be at all concerned. If you have several of these in a hive, that's a sign that your hive is struggling, and you might want to give them some brood to boost up strength, etc. This picture on the left is a frame that has been slimed with small hive beetle larvae. They kind of eat the resources and kind of leave this slimy mess behind. And the picture on the right is sliming. Oops, not yet. The picture on the right is wax moth damage and sliming from small hive beetle larvae. When this happens, like this picture on the right, you can just scrape off those wax moth webbings and then freeze the frame to kill any eggs and small hive beetle larvae. And then you can reuse this frame next year. There's nothing wrong with this frame, but you do want to freeze it to get rid of the larva potentially. So, okay, so with that, what you've all been waiting for, let's get into the Q&A. So I'm going to end the PowerPoint so you can see all of our faces. Jake, if you should be able to unmute yourself, and if you are planning to show your screen, you don't have to if you weren't planning on it.
His face.
Yeah, your face. Sorry.
Your
I'm not sure if that's a good idea.
Totally your call, Jake. And Sherry, I'll let you take it from here.
Your spotlight's on.
Oh, there we go. I'll take it off. Perfect.
Here we go. All right, Jake, come on, let's see your face.
I'm trying to. It says the host has stopped it.
Oh, hang tight there, Jake. I will fix that for you.
That's how he does. He wants the whole floor. That's not true. Well, I'm gonna start introducing you while we're figuring out that. So everybody, Jake Osborne, I met Jake Osborne in, I think 2015, 2016, I believe it was when it was.
That sounds right.
That's right, right.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I have been pretty good friends over the years, and I just love him to death. He's about 8 feet tall. And I can say that since we can't see your picture, right?
Right.
Right. But Jake has got a commercial bee company called Kentucky Honey Farms, and he's out of Kentucky, hence the word Kentucky. And matter of fact, this week I've been working for, I don't know, probably a year now, trying to get him pinned down in this season, which is the commercial guy's busy season, to do an interview with me. And so this last Tuesday, Jake so kindly, he did an interview. There he is. There he is.
Hey.
So kind to do an interview. And it was a good interview, wasn't it, Jake?
Yeah, I believe it was.
We did good. We did good. So anyway, so we had some great questions, y'all. Blake, and it's fun for us to listen, James and I, to listen to you and type at the same time. That's a challenge, but we did. We did. So I've got some notes and also got some questions. So how we want to do this is some folks have left some questions in here. One, I'm going to, Rachel, I want you to hold your question. I'm going to answer that one because I know the answer. Let's go to, here's a good one from Anonymous. We know several of those people. Right. So you said, I don't need to add pollen source to a new hive or nuke, only give syrup. I was going to add a pollen patty in the syrup since the bees won't know where to find pollen. I understand one is for encouraging brood growth and one for making honey. Thank you. I'm really enjoying this. To give you a little background, I think it's a new hive. Okay. And I think she was thinking about putting or had put a super on it and it wasn't filling. So that's where we back up and say, I think we need to grow the bottom brood box, right? Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, I agree. Typically when we talk about what to use, in nature setting, you have nectar and you have pollen. The nectar is the carbohydrate source for the bees, the energy source, and the pollen is the protein source. So the pollen is going to be utilized for brood production, whereas the nectar is going to be used as an energy source as well as to encourage wax production and so forth. So I'm not sure what is her exact I
think it was because she was saying that she wasn't building wax, and we're saying don't feed right now if nectar's flowing, but I really think that, just what you said, building wax is what she's needing to do, and probably feed pollen if she's not got very much, not very many bees.
Sure. So obviously I'm located in Kentucky, and I would assume that a lot of your viewers will be in Texas.
Some are, we've had some that were well away today.
Okay. Well, I always like to encourage people in my area, which is further north. I always encourage people that first year that you start your colony, you are getting that colony built up and you're already preparing for winter. So I would, I always tell people who just started keeping bees, their first year, you just want to get that colony built up. And I usually recommend getting them built up into 2 hive bodies. Typically where I'm at, 50, 60 pounds of feed, honey, syrup, whatever will get you through our winters here. So with that being said, and then in your second year, that is when you can focus on honey production. So depending on where this person is located, really depends on what her strategy needs to be. If he or she is located further south, they could probably go ahead and maybe focus on trying to make some honey production. I don't know if you mentioned to your viewers, even though I'm located in Kentucky, I'm also overwintering in Florida, South Florida. So, and it's much, much different there than it is here in Kentucky. They actually have a large fall nectar flow. So a colony that was just established, say this time of the year, it can easily be built up and make a fall honey crop in Florida. So it really depends where you're located at.
Good, that's it right there, right, Blake?
Absolutely. Love it.
I'm gonna give this one to Blake. This one kind of made me chuckle because I wish. It says, why don't people use drone comb in a honey super? Wouldn't the larger cells produce more honey?
Well, that's a great question.
Isn't it?
Yeah. So I mean the frame, it's really limited by the frame size. So the frame is a certain size, and I think it's going to store about the same amount of honey, whether it's a drone comb or a worker bee comb. It wouldn't hurt to have drone. I've seen drone comb up in the supers. The other challenge with that is we often convert supers to brood boxes. So a lot of beekeepers, it might be a super for 4 or 5 or 6 years. And then once the comb gets a little older, now we want to use it for a brood box. So if it was all drone comb, we couldn't use it interchangeably. And so that's why we tend to do everything as worker bee comb. And that way it's more interchangeable in the long run.
But that was a great question, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, logic tells me that should store more honey. I thought, gosh, I've never thought about that. So I want to back up because Rachel it was her first question. She was first in line. So she says, and I know this answer, I purchased the top feeder and opened it after a week, hundreds of dead bees inside. How do I fix this from happening? Well, Rachel, I know this problem. This has to do with a violation around that screen in the center. So there's 2 things that have happened. That screen has either popped out away from those teeth, because there's some little teeth that go along the left and right side of that center of that top feeder, or the screw wasn't down good, or that it's just popped out. The bees have inched their way through it. If that happened, I would get a silicone caulk. James was always the one that did it for ours. Silicone caulk and caulk around the edge of that screen. And that way it will prevent it from popping out again. Also, when a hive is open, the bees tend to go in. So you may have been open a little long and you closed it back up and somewhere in there and they died. So that's Rachel, I think that's your question. So James is saying, what do you want me to ask? How do you find pollen?
First question had to do with how are my bees going to know where to find pollen?
Oh, how are my bees going to know where to find pollen? Either one
It's
of
what
you.
they do. Oh, I can answer that really fastly. It's what
It's
they
what
do.
they do.
Yeah.
One of the
It's what
few
they
things.
do.
One of the few things we don't have to worry about.
Isn't that awesome? What an easy answer. That's just what they do. All right. So did the freezer, this was about freezing frames. So if you've got a dead out, what do I know you guys have, you're commercial beekeepers. So if you've got a dead out, what do? Do you save the frames or do you toss them?
I absolutely reuse them. The only situation where I would not reuse equipment is if there is a situation with American foul brood. Thankfully I have not had any interaction with that, thankfully. And so, but yeah, absolutely. I have no issues at all reusing drawn comb or frames or boxes for that matter. So yeah.
So what do you do if it's got larvae in it? Do you just let it get robbed out away from your bee yard, at the edge of your bee yard, and to get the
Well,
bees to clean it out, or?
if it's a situation like, say, for some random reason, the hive absconded, meaning the entire population left, and there was still living brood in there, then I would, as soon as possible, get that brood moved into another colony. Because, you know, brood has to be maintained at a certain temperature. I believe it's 92.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So as if that brood is not chilled, and it's still valuable, then you can definitely utilize that to put into a different colony, whether to boost the population or just to, you know, simply keep it alive.
Jake, what do you guys do? I'm curious. What about wax moth damage? You know, when you have frames that, you know, hive died and has wax moth damage, do you tend to scrape it down to the foundation, recoat it with wax, reuse it, throw it away? You know, severe wax moth damage, like over half the frame is damaged. What do you guys do with that?
Well, we, just like you said, if it's severe, we will scrape it down. And normally when it comes to wax moths, I mean, they really get all the wax. And so we have to scrape it down and then recoat the frames with wax. And it's kind of a pain, but you know, when you're in this business, you got to save every penny that you can. So we will definitely recoat those frames with wax. And if it's just a small amount of damage, normally we can just scrape that off, put it in the hive, and the bees will just take right to it and rebuild it, and you're back in the race. So
Yeah, it is a pain. I feel like everything's kind of a pain, and usually on that scale. How do you guys recoat with wax when you're recoating in that volume?
Well, me personally, I just take the time, and I have a really crappy pot that I get at the dollar store or wherever, and I'll keep wax in it, and I just take a really cheap brush and just brush it on. If I was doing a very large amount, I would try to possibly get a large pan pot and actually dip the frame in it, shake it a little bit, and just keep doing that as much as possible.
Yeah, love it. Sorry, Sherry.
No, you read my mind. That's actually what I was thinking. And then James said, so when you scrape off, the one thing that we've run into is when you scrape a tunnel, the bees just go, I didn't see that. And they ignore that what we scrape off. Do y'all have that experience too? They don't rebuild that spot we scrape off?
Sometimes.
Depends on the honey flow. If
Yeah,
really strong honey
that's
flow,
true
or
too.
if you're feeding hard, they will. But if it's mediocre, then they'll do it last.
That is so true. They'll just kind of ignore it. So this next question is Nancy. What's the best way to deal with wonky comb? Smash it down or scrape it off?
I'm assuming that wonky comb would be burr comb. Is that what we're?
Or she's probably talking about, Blake's got an article coming out in the June issue about that. It could be standoff comb, where they just go, I'm not going to attach to the frame. I want to do this hovering about it, or very bump, where it's really inconsistent.
If it's like you were saying, where it's just like a blob here and here, and it's not, congruent with the frame, I normally will try to just scrape it off. I really am bad about this, but I need to be better at it. Every time I scrape off any kind of wax, I would love to, and I need to do this more. I still do it, but I need to keep those little tiny scrapings of wax, keep them. I would place them on top of the hive, and then right before I leave the bee yard, come back through there and pick it up and save that wax. But yeah, I would just scrape it off, and hopefully, we can try again. And if it's a really severe case, say, I've seen bees where the coating on the foundation, just for some reason, it wasn't good enough. And it's almost like they build pillars, And then they put
Yes.
a whole nother set of comb on top of there. If
It's
it's
like a
something
second story.
Yes.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If it's something like that, I want to pull that frame out, take it back to the shop, re-wax it, and then put it back into use.
Like,
So
do it over, girls. That wasn't the right way.
We
Blake,
have
do you,
a,
Blake, do
go
you
ahead,
think
Sherry.
that's a sign that they need to be requeened, Blake, or is that just?
No, I don't think it has anything to do with the queen. It's often more of maybe the foundation was old and a little dusty, or I mean, bees don't read the books we read. I mean, they
They
just
don't.
they have a mind of their own. And yeah, I've noticed some breeds of bee tend to draw comb a little differently, but usually it's a foundation issue or there was too much space left between the frames, something like
Right.
that. It cracks me up. One of our facilities, we have a big, huge kitchen, commercial kitchen that all of our seasonal employees, we've got a lot of housing. We've got this big common kitchen area where they can all come in and cook their meals. And every time I go in there, there's like this huge plate in the middle of the table, and it's the wonky comb plate, and it's all this honeycomb they pulled out of the bee yard, out of the hives, and then they eat it. It's their candy. They've got honey in it.
Because it's
And,
just like the good one.
Yeah, I mean, hey, if it's got honey in it, go for it. And so yeah, we've got this big. I should get a little label for it though. The wonky comb plate. I like that. I like that name.
I do too. But like I said, you've got to the questioner, you've got an article coming out in the June issue about how to deal with it. And it works really, really well. Let's see. How do you manage different strength hives in the same bee yard without robbing risk? That's a good question.
I'm curious here, Jake, Florida, you're dealing with Southern Florida. I'm curious.
yeah, well, robbing, if say you're going to a bee yard and you're doing, you want to inspect all your colonies, depending on the time of the year, robbing can get pretty vicious. So there's a couple things that you can do. We can either, try to cut down inspection time, maybe instead of pulling out multiple frames, maybe just pop the lid, pull out one frame just to make sure that they have about, you see eggs, larvae, and whatnot, and try to minimize the actual time that you're inside the hive. That's one thing. Another thing that we do is the timing. So if you want to do it at a certain time of the day where there's less bees or less foragers, so maybe in the middle of the day, there's less bees because the foragers are out in the field working. That's a possible strategy. I've also seen beekeepers where say they have to do work in the bee yard and they want to do splits and there's not a nectar flow going on. So the bees, they're irritable and they're wanting to rob. They will actually set out large containers, whether it's I'm not sure how you would describe it, maybe even a barrel, an open barrel, and they'll put just about 5 or 10 gallons of sugar syrup in there. And what that does is you're essentially creating a temporary community feeder. And so you place that in there. After a couple hours, the bees are working that. And that really helps out with eliminating the robin situation. So, like I said, there's just a couple
Like
of things
that.
you can do. Yeah.
That's that. I love
Love
that. You're just reorienting them, telling them, go
Mhm.
rob over there.
Yeah.
Let us deal
Right.
with what we're doing here. That's a
Right.
great idea. Matter of fact, that's what you had answered that for mean bees in
Yes.
our interview the other day.
Yeah.
I thought was brilliant. I hadn't
Yeah.
thought of that. You
Can
have
I
any input
ask?
on?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm curious to take that question a slightly different way. The person asking this didn't ask this, but I'm curious when you go to a VR, Jake, you're going to have hives of all different strengths. You're going to have, any time of year, you're going to have the bursting at the seams and the half dead. And as a general practice, how do you guys handle that? I mean, do you try equalizing brood? Do you just leave it be, let the bad ones die, let the good ones thrive? When you're dealing with all this variation of strength, how do you guys handle that? Or do you not?
Yeah. Well, if there is a variation in strength, then that would tell me that there might be an issue with your queens. So, but to answer your question, we do a lot of equalizing. So we will take brood, we'll take honey, and we will equalize the hives. We'll take from the strong hive and give to the weaker colony. But one thing that I want to pay attention to is that as I'm looking at that weaker colony, I'm looking at the brood from that colony and really determining what's going on here. How come this hive isn't as strong as this one? Is it something with the queen? Is it a mite issue? Is it a lack of resources, food, pollen issue? Let's just, for example, the queen. If that brood pattern is not completely, if it's not solid, or if it's spotty, it looks like somebody took a shotgun to it, real spotty and whatnot, maybe that hive needs to have a new queen, needs to be requeened. But it's typically, with a practice of mine, I do a lot of equalizing. So, and that's really, that's killing two birds with one stone. Not only is it bringing that weaker colony up to par, but it's also creating space in that strong colony, thereby helping to eliminate swarming.
Mhm.
So,
Absolutely.
anyway.
Love it. Totally agree. Yeah.
Does he mark it? What was your question? James he doesn't want to come on camera. How do you mark, how do you mark the bad colony, Jake? Do you
How do I-
one of those that you put a brick this direction or a brick this direction?
Oh,
That's marking the bad colony?
yeah. So I picked this up when I was in Florida. You can get these at Lowe's, Home Depot. Usually you can find them in the tool section. It's called a lumber crayon. So just like, like a kid with a crayon, they have lumber ones that are, pretty good size. And I write on the lid. A lot of my lids just 3/4 inch board, and I write on them. I kind of have my own style. So if it's like a QL, that means it's queenless. If it's a VQ, virgin queen. So
We went to your school. That's what we do exactly. If you go look at the hives at the Dayton store, all of them have all this,
yeah,
it looks like shorthand,
Yeah.
but it works really good, and you can smudge it out. And when you run out of room,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
just smudge it out. It works
Yeah.
really, really, really
well,
good.
I found that, after probably about 3 or 4 weeks with, weather and rain, it goes away.
Fades
So
away,
now you got a clean slate to work with.
right? Well, we've done the block turned up, the block
Mhm.
on its side, turned to
Yep.
north.
Yep,
We've done
that's one
that.
way. That's effective way too.
All right, let's find another question. So, how long after putting a swarm in a box will it be before the queen starts laying if I provide them with drawn comb? My past experience is that she does not seem to start laying immediately after swarming, but not sure what should be expected. I'm not sure what should be expected. Either one of you.
Go for it, Jake.
Oh,
I get to talk all the time.
oh, okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, if by all means, if you need to correct me, please do, because I know a little bit about bees, but it kind of seems to me that the more you learn about bees, the less you realize that you actually know. It's one of them.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how long does it take the queen to start laying after the swarm? Keep in mind that when the queen swarms, prior to that swarming event, her ovaries will actually shrink. And that happens because she needs to be able to be a little bit smaller, a little bit less weight, because she's going to be making this long flight away from the colony and during this swarming event. So really, to answer your question, it's kind of, there's not really a hardcore definite answer. It could be 2 weeks. It could be a few days right after the hive or the swarm has been hived or placed into a beehive. So it really depends. But honestly, I would say after a couple weeks, maybe even 10 to 14 days, if you're not seeing that queen, if you're not starting to see eggs, you might want to start, maybe planning on either requeening it or whatnot. I always encourage people who have established colonies, once they catch a swarm, go ahead and get a frame of brood and place it into that swarm colony. Brood pheromone the smell of brood in the hive really keeps things in order. And without that, you kind of have, it kind of gets chaotic. That's whenever you start to see laying workers start to develop, and it's just the whole hive just kind of becomes unorderly. So it's always been a practice of mine to take brood from an established colony and put it into a new captured swarm. And another thing to touch on, that swarm that you cut could potentially have a virgin queen. So then once she is placed into the hive, the swarm is caught, it may take another 10 to 14 days for her to do her mating flights. So there you go. That's my
Perfect
answer.
answer.
All right. Good
Way
deal.
better, way better. I was just gonna say soonish. So yeah, yeah, that's really good.
Very
Yeah, the
good
only
answer.
thing I would add is sometimes I would feed a swarm if they're like starving, if they were hanging on a tree for 7 days and then you put them in a box and you don't feed them and there's not a nectar flow, they can just be starved and not, they might be cannibalizing those eggs. So yes, I usually feed those swarms and that helps speed up that queen a bit.
Yeah, very good point.
Good. A question about, could putting a honey super on cause a colony to abscond? We've been asked that before, everything was fine. I put the super on and then went back a week or two later and they left me. What do you think? You think it's just that it's the shock, or maybe they put it on too soon, or we don't know?
I've seen it happen twice. One was when it was a wet honey super in a weak hive and it encouraged robbing. And so it sucked all the robber bees in. Wet honey super meaning it had a lot of honey in it that the robber bees could smell, and they just robbed out the hive, which can look like absconding, and sometimes the bees do abscond after robbing. The other time was when I didn't let my supers air out from wax moth crystals. So if they were stored with wax moth crystals and I just immediately stuck it on the hive, that made them abscond. But other than that, I've not seen it. Jake, what about you?
I haven't seen it either. Those are some very good points. But just if it's just simply the case of adding a box with no other factors, it shouldn't cause them to abscond.
I figured there
Right.
was something else at play as well, something else. And it's funny you said, we'll use that as a segue. Blake, you said something about what moth crystals. This question is, how fast after removing paramoth is the window do I have before I have to worry about small hive beetles or moths attacking my stored honey supers? I didn't proof that question, but you get what the point is. How
Maybe two
fast-
questions there.
It kind of was. How fast after removing the paramoth is the window do I have before I have to worry about small hive beetles or moths attacking my stored honey supers? There's an extra word in there. Sorry.
Go ahead, Blake.
It's been a minute since I've used wax moth crystal. So Jake, you may be more up to date on that than I am. I mean, if you're asking how long can your stored supers go without wax moth crystals, it depends on the weather. If you're below freezing every night, forever. If you're 80 degrees during the day, yeah, I wouldn't want them without wax moth crystals more than maybe a week, 10 days. And stay protected.
We actually do this. This is kind of our go-to method because we don't have tens of thousands of hives like y'all do. And James he makes a big tower of the supers, and then he's going to tape around each seam very well, and then a piece of cardboard on the top, and it's taped very well. So then he's got his entry points. He goes in and reinstalls the paramoth every so often, but truly once it's kind of permeated the box, he can get by with only refreshing it a couple of times, and it will sit probably until next season. So refresh it 2 or 3 times and that about it. And then it'll sit till the next season. I think that answers the question. So, I mean, it lasts a while because it really does. And anybody that's using paramoth has used it in the past. You definitely want to air those boxes for at least, gosh, what? Forever and a day, James said, a week, 2 weeks. It's strong. Well, Blake, we're 8:01, and I'm gonna tell you two that I laughed all day every time I was writing something down, Blake and Jake. It just,
It,
So
it
it
sounds
was
like a
hard
good,
to me.
sounds like a good podcast.
It does. Blake and Jake, Blake and Jake at 8. Oh,
Oh, there you go.
Oh, there it is.
Trademark it.
Yeah,
trademark
write
it.
it down.
Great, y'all. I think this was great. And anybody that has questions still open, James and I'll answer them. But I truly think that this was a great opportunity to welcome everybody, get everybody in, to know Jake Osborne, and he's been keeping bees since he was 8 years old. So he kind of knows a little bit, and I think we all can tell that now. So
Absolutely.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna hand it back to you, Blake, and let you do the salutations. Thanks,
Yeah, I
Jake.
mean,
And I'll see you.
thank you, Jake. Yeah, I really,
Not
really
a problem.
appreciate it.
Anytime.
And yeah, super, super helpful. My only regret is that we didn't just leave a full hour for the questions. We usually have a guest the last 30 minutes. We should have done an hour this time because I could have gone 2 hours listening. So thanks for what you're sharing. And we hope to, and I haven't talked about this at all, but our hope is over the summer or fall to eventually start launching a more sideline commercial webinar. So we focus more small scale on this one. We're looking at a sideline and commercial monthly webinar too. So we'll have to have you back for that too, because
Absolutely.
dive more into the complexities of sideline and commercial beekeeping. So, but thank you again. It was wonderful to have
No
you.
problem. Anytime.
Awesome. Folks, that's about it. So just as a quick reminder, we will have a follow-up email, and we'll have a link to this recording in the follow-up email. We'll have a link to all the videos we referenced. I know several times we referenced, hey, go check out our YouTube channel because we have a video about mite checks and requeening, et cetera. And so we'll link to all those we talked about in that follow-up email, as well as a link to the Bee Supply Monthly magazine. So with that, guys, we'll see you in June. If you have questions, feel free to continue putting them in the Q&A box. James, Sherry, and I will hang out and answer those questions. But until then, we will see you. We'll see you in June.